My name is Chloe, and I'm 29 years old. Let me tell you a little story about how I turned the tables on my ex-husband, Mark. You see, Mark was 6 years older than me, and we met through a mutual friend named Alex. At that time, I was all about my career, and I didn't care much for romance. I loved my job and found fulfillment in it. But my friend Sarah was worried that I was drifting away from the idea of marriage. She introduced me to Mark, who was the complete opposite of me, outgoing, friendly, and always ready to have a good time. We thought we could complement each other, so we decided to tie the knot. Our marriage started off fine, but there was one issue that kept nagging at me: my relationship with Mark's mom. To put it bluntly, she didn't like me working so much and having separate finances. She thought it was indecent. She constantly criticized my job and our marriage. She had something to say about everything, from where we lived to the content of our wedding. It was exhausting, especially with my busy work schedule. When I talked to Mark about it, he would always dismiss it, saying, "Mom is just lonely. We don't have Dad anymore, and she's living alone now. Can you bear with it and keep her company?" So, I did my best to endure it. But the real trouble started when we decided to buy a house. We had discussed living separately from his mom, which was a relief, considering our strained relationship. However, I suggested living with my parents, as my mom wasn't in the best health, and my dad was getting on in years. Michael readily agreed, saying, "That's a great idea. We were planning on buying a fairly large house anyway, and we can even consult with your parents." I was thrilled, but when I mentioned it to my mother-in-law, she refused outright, saying, "I refuse to live with a daughter-in-law like you." Her words stung, but I didn't dwell on it because we never intended to live together in the first place. As we continued our meetings with the real estate company, an unexpected visitor appeared at our apartment, my sister-in-law. She had gotten married and divorced, and now she needed financial help. I reluctantly gave her some money, which she took without much gratitude. Later, when I refused to give her more, she got furious and started yelling at me. But that wasn't the end of it. She took the money I had stored in envelopes, and I felt a mix of fear and desperation as I watched them leave. When I told Mark about it, he brushed it off, saying, "They're in trouble, so it can't be helped. We're family. Just handle it somehow." I was already anxious about our married life, and Mark's absence and lack of communication only fueled my suspicions. I had many sleepless nights. To avoid being swindled out of money, I started avoiding my sister-in-law and mother-in-law. We finally found a beautiful house. The environment was perfect, and we planned to invite my parents over after moving in. But just when everything seemed perfect, Mark dropped a bombshell. He announced that he wanted to live in the new house with his family and told me to leave. I couldn't believe it. It was completely different from our previous discussions. I thought it was a misunderstanding, but Mark accused me of being responsible for our strained relationship and said, "I want to take care of my family, and it's because you've been harassing my mom and sister that things have come to this." He claimed I hadn't been supportive, and my heart sank. As Mark continued to berate me, I couldn't hold back the tears. He yelled at me, "I'm tired and had enough. I don't want to see your face anymore. Get out right away." It was a painful moment for me. To make matters worse, he wanted to take over the house for himself and his family. He was fed up with our issues and my work, so he decided to kick me out. It was a harsh reality to face. I loved Mark, but our relationship had broken down. I realized it was time to part ways. When I mentioned divorce, Mark didn't seem surprised. He agreed to it reluctantly, and I decided to start recording our conversations to ensure everything was fair. I couldn't help but feel a sense of irony when I learned about Mark's own troubles. He had been fired from his job, and it seemed he couldn't find another one due to his past issues. He resorted to a low-paying part-time job and struggled to make ends meet. It was a far cry from the outgoing, lively man I had married. But my problems weren't over. My sister-in-law, who had been begging for money, had her own secrets. She had cheated on her husband in the past, even though she had told me she was the victim of infidelity. It was a painful revelation, and I felt betrayed. As I moved on with my life, my relationship with my parents became even stronger. We found a better house and prepared to start a peaceful and happy life together. I had left behind the chaos and drama of my marriage, and I was looking forward to a bright future. But the story doesn't end there. The echoes of my past with Mark and his family still reverberate, and there's more to come. It's been some time since I left behind the tumultuous chapter of my life with Mark and his family. The decision to divorce him was undoubtedly one of the most challenging I've ever made. But in hindsight, it was the right one. As I settled into my new life, my relationship with my parents became even more cherished. The house we had moved into was a significant upgrade from our previous one. Its spacious and well-lit kitchen was a joy to work in, and the layout made housework a breeze. My parents and I were excited about the prospect of living in such a comfortable and inviting space, and we looked forward to calling it our home. The new environment was perfect, and the three of us were thrilled to start this new phase of our lives together. We discussed inviting my parents over, and I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude and happiness. "Thank you so much. This is so much nicer than our previous house," my mom exclaimed with a smile. My dad nodded in agreement, his eyes filled with contentment. I had put my past behind me, and the toxic relationships I had endured with Mark's family were slowly fading into the background. But while I was basking in the newfound tranquility of my life, I couldn't help but wonder about Mark and the chaos that had unfolded on his side. The last I heard, he was struggling with a low-paying part-time job, unable to cover the mortgage on the house we had once shared. My decision to divorce Mark was not an easy one, but it had become apparent that it was necessary for my own well-being. His infidelity, financial irresponsibility, and the incessant drama that surrounded his family had become unbearable. So, I walked away, hoping to find peace and stability. However, the echoes of my past with Mark still reverberated. Our divorce was not without its fair share of drama. He had been desperately trying to win me back, insisting that we could reconcile. But my mind was set. I had moved on and wasn't willing to revisit that tumultuous chapter. Yet, I received a message from Mark one day, and when I saw his name flashing on my phone, I hesitated for a moment. I had no intention of rekindling any connection with him, but a nagging curiosity made me answer the call. "Emily, don't you dare ignore my calls," Mark said, his voice a mix of desperation and anger. I was at work when he called, and his sudden intrusion took me by surprise. "What do you expect now? What do you want?" I responded indifferently. I was determined to maintain my composure and not let Mark's attempts at manipulation affect me. "I can't pay the mortgage on the house if this continues. I'm going to lose my home." Mark's voice quivered, and I could sense the desperation in his words. I was unfazed and responded, "Oh, and what does that have to do with me?" Despite his predicament, I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy for him. After all, I had dealt with enough trauma in my time with Mark. Mark continued, "I know we're divorced, but we're still family. You're my ex-wife, and I need your help." I scoffed. "Family? That's rich, coming from you. You and your family were nothing but trouble." I wasn't going to let his words' guilt trip me into helping him. Mark seemed to have a moment of realization. "You're still working, right, Emily?" I admit my mistake. "You weren't bullying my mom and sister, right?" He had previously accused me of attacking his family, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication as he retracted his false accusations. I was not ready to forgive and forget. "What are you bringing that up now for?" His sudden change of heart did little to sway my resolve. Mark's pleas continued. My sister and mom are just being selfish. I'll kick them out, and you got it all wrong. I wasn't interested in his attempts to make amends. You won't talk or come home. And upon checking, you were having an affair. I reminded him of his betrayal, determined not to let him manipulate the narrative. Mark vehemently denied it. That's not true. It's a misunderstanding. I had heard enough and decided to set the record straight. You think it's a misunderstanding? Haven't you heard from the lawyer? But Mark continued to plead. I was the one who sent a lawyer after you. My patience was wearing thin. I had been investigating this matter for quite some time, and I had evidence. I was claiming alimony for your affair. Mark accused me of trying to take advantage. All that is a setup. You just want the house back, right? I was done with his games. I'm not interested in reconciling Mark. I've moved on with my life. But Mark persisted. So you won't even consider remarrying me and coming back home? My response was firm. No way. That's out of the question. I was determined to stand my ground. The painful memories of our past, the betrayal, and the drama that had surrounded our marriage were not something I was willing to relive. Mark's tone grew more desperate. Please, you're still working, right, Emily? I admit my mistake. You weren't bullying my mom and sister. You were a good wife. I couldn't believe the sudden change in his demeanor. It was as though he had finally realized the error of his ways. But I had moved on, and his pleas fell on deaf ears. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, a sense of vindication for having stood up for myself, and a lingering sadness for the love that had once been between us. Mark was no longer the man I had married, and our paths had diverged in a way I never could have anticipated. Life continued to unfold as I settled into my new home with my parents. Our days were filled with a sense of peace and contentment that had been sorely lacking in my previous marriage. The echoes of my past with Mark still lingered in the background, but they seemed distant, like faint whispers of a life I had once known. As the months passed, I immersed myself in my work and relished the simplicity of everyday life. The drama and chaos of Mark's family were no longer a part of my world, and I had come to appreciate the tranquility that had eluded me for so long. But the specter of my past was not completely gone. Mark's desperate attempts to reconnect and his financial struggles were a constant reminder of the tumultuous relationship we had shared. I had made a clean break from that chapter of my life, and I was determined to keep it that way. One day, as I was diligently going about my work, I received an unexpected call from Sarah, the mutual friend who had introduced me to Mark. Her voice was filled with a mix of concern and curiosity as she asked, "Chloe, have you heard from Mark recently?" I couldn't help but feel a tinge of annoyance at the mention of his name. Why would I want to hear from him? I replied with a hint of sarcasm. Sarah continued, "Well, I ran into him the other day, and he looked like he's going through a really tough time. He mentioned something about financial troubles and the divorce." I maintained my composure but couldn't suppress a sense of satisfaction. Well, that's what happens when you betray your spouse and your family. I'm not responsible for his choices. Sarah hesitated for a moment and then said, "I understand, but I just thought you should know." He seemed pretty desperate. I thanked Sarah for the information, but assured her that I had moved on and had no intentions of revisiting the past. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Mark's struggles were a consequence of his actions, and I had no reason to feel guilty or responsible for his predicament. Life continued to unfold peacefully, and my relationship with my parents grew stronger with each passing day. We cherished the moments we shared, whether it was preparing meals together in our bright and spacious kitchen, or simply sitting down for a cup of tea and conversation. As the seasons changed, I found solace in the simplicity of my life. I had rediscovered the joy of spending quality time with my parents, and nurturing the relationships that truly mattered. The echoes of my past with Mark were no more than distant memories, and I was determined to keep it that way. But life had a way of surprising me. One evening, as I sat in the cozy living room of our new home, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and was surprised to see Mark's name flashing on the screen once again. Part of me wanted to ignore the call and leave the past where it belonged, but curiosity got the better of me. With a deep breath, I answered the call. "What do you want, Mark?" His voice was a mix of desperation and sorrow as he spoke. "Chloe, I know I messed up, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm in a really tough spot right now, and I don't know where else to turn." I couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for him, despite the anger and hurt that had defined our past. "What's going on, Mark?" I asked cautiously. He went on to explain that he had been struggling with his part-time job, barely making enough to cover the mortgage on the house we had once shared. His savings had dwindled, and he was drowning in debt. "I never thought it would come to this," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. While my initial instinct was to stand my ground, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of empathy. After all, we had once been deeply connected, and it was painful to see someone I had loved fall so far. "What do you want from me, Mark?" I asked, my tone softened. Mark's plea was genuine. "I can't lose the house, Chloe. It's not just about me, it's about my family. I'm worried about my mom and sister. They have nowhere else to go, and it's all falling apart." Despite my reservations, I couldn't turn a blind eye to the potential consequences of Mark's situation. I knew what it felt like to be in dire straits, and I didn't want to see his family suffer. "I'll consider helping, but under one condition," I stated firmly. Mark's voice held a glimmer of hope. "What condition, Chloe?" I didn't mince words. "You need to take responsibility for your actions and make amends. It's not just about financial assistance. It's about acknowledging the pain you've caused and working to make things right." Mark hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "I understand, Chloe. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." With a sense of resolution, I knew that this would be a new chapter in our complicated history. Whether it led to reconciliation or simply provided a temporary lifeline, I was prepared to face it head-on. The echoes of my past with Mark were still present, but this time I would approach them with a sense of understanding and the hope for closure. As I ended the call, I couldn't help but wonder how this unexpected turn of events would shape our futures, and whether we could find a way to heal the wounds of our past. The story was far from over, and the journey continued with uncertainty and a glimmer of hope.